Welcome to episode 363 of the DFO Rundown, brought to you by Bet365. Download the app today. Use the promo code NATION to get in on a huge range of markets, whatever the moment. It's never ordinary at Bet365. Of course, it is a trade deadline week. The trade deadline coming up this Friday. We are recording this on Monday morning. We had some deals over the weekend. As I'm Jason Greger, we welcome in Frank Saravalli. And man, I am fired up. The trade has got going over the weekend. Of course, 3 deals: Nyquist to Minnesota, Lindgren goes to Colorado, and Seth Jones to the Florida Panthers. And the Panthers then put Matthew Tkachuk on LTIR, so they make the deal go. The Blackhawks are hoping they get their goalie of the future in Spencer Knight. Frank, it's a pretty big deal, but I'll say, man, I said it last week. Seth Jones at $7 million, I'd take him all day. I think you're going to see Seth Jones on a good team, and people are going to be like, oh, he is still pretty good.
Yeah, I think quality number 2 defenseman who you're going to see rejuvenated in a big way to play with quality players again and to have a chance to win, an authentic chance to win. Look, I hate the way this sounds because this is not me. And if you listen to the pod, you know it's not me. I'm not a fence sitter. I think this deal is a win-win. And I think those are the best trades to make when you find out or you put yourself in a situation where I think the reason why we don't see more activity in the NHL is because someone's trying to win the deal. Someone's trying to win the press conference. And when you can settle down and sit across from one another and orchestrate something like this that makes sense and fits for both parties, that's when you see trades happen. And look, the Hawks get, to your point, their goalie of the future, they believe, in Spencer Knight, and the first round pick. And we'll talk about why that's important in a second. But in Florida, I hadn't really considered them an authentic inner circle cup contender this year because they didn't properly replace Montour and Ekman-Larsson. Now, if you can go Forsling, Jones, Ekblad, and Mikkola as your top 4, those guys can eat so many minutes. You might not need a third pair. Like, I'm not exaggerating.
That's what the Blackhawks did. Remember when the Blackhawks won the cup with their top 4? Their third pair didn't play very much.
I covered that cup final in 2010. The Flyers' third pair, Ryan Parent, played 27 seconds in a cup final playoff game as the 6th defenseman. 27 seconds.
Yeah, well, that's when they had the human rake, Chris Pronger, out there eating about 35 minutes a night.
Jones played 25-18 this year, or that's what he's averaged over 4 years for the Hawks.
No, he can play.
And so can Forsling. And so you look at those guys and you go, all right, they're not ever coming off the ice. I don't care what their third pair looks like. Doesn't matter. Irrelevant.
To me, I think this is a big win for Florida. So if you just look at how you manage the cap, you had a $4.5 million backup who was going to be your backup this year. He's going to be your backup again next year. And now you're paying $7 million for a top pair defenseman. So you think about just the added ice time, and you just outlined 25 minutes a night for a guy who might play 25 games a year for an extra $2.5 million. Yeah, I think this is a big win. Obviously, Chicago, they get the goalie of the future, but my goodness, Frank, that goalie of the future, he's going to go from a Florida team to Chicago team, and he's like, oh, geez, life's a little bit different here in Chicago, where it might be a shooting gallery some nights. You take Seth Jones on that lineup. Like, who's playing defense in Chicago?
So 2 things. One, this is not what you're going to be convincing Spencer Knight is going to be in front of him, because that's not what's going to be in front of him. Artem Levshunov, number 2 overall pick. Sam Renzel, I mentioned this on a recent pod, I think can have every bit the NHL impact that Brock Faber has had with the Minnesota Wild. And 2, for Spencer Knight, finally a path forward. Sergei Bobrovsky has been blocking the way since basically the day he was drafted. The same month that they drafted Spencer Knight 13th overall, they signed Bobrovsky to a 7-year deal. At some point along the way, it looked like Bobrovsky was shaky and might cede the net to Spencer Knight, which is why they signed him to that 3-year, $4.5 million a year deal, which he's still on. But now Bobrovsky still has 1 year left on his deal. There was no path for Spencer Knight to be a starter in Florida in the foreseeable future. For Florida, as long as Bobrovsky's healthy, that guy's a worker, a grinder who keeps himself in great shape. You just re-sign him to a cheaper number. He's made $100 million in his career. So I think Spencer Knight gets an opportunity with an up and coming team. And obviously he's already been well paid, $12.5 million or more than that, $13.5 million in his career without ever having been a starter. Do you know how many guys that are goalies would have killed for that by the time they're 24?
Dude, how many skaters would have killed for making 13.5? And, not many guys are getting 4.5 sheets and you're playing 25 games a year or you're in the minors. So yeah, financially he's been good. And, we'll see. Chicago, it's still their rebuild, as I said many years. They got to be ultra patient because there's no quick fix. And they bring in Spencer Knight, but it's like Mrazek's been quite good for them in goal. So, I think they need a good quality veteran around Spencer Knight because there's going to be days when he's going to feel like, God, I'm letting in too many goals, but it's not going to be him. It's going to be the environment in front of him.
Mm-hmm. Well, you got to be patient.
The other big deal on the weekend, Colorado.
Wait, before we move on, I just want to say quickly, obviously now a crowded crease for Chicago. They've got to make a move, I think, and they're going to try to this week with Peter Mrazek to flip him somewhere. I don't think they're looking for much in return. Quite honestly, I don't even know if they're looking for anything at all. It's not a cap thing. I think you look at Mrazek, just a victim of circumstances here. I'm wondering if there's a playoff team, Edmonton, that could use a guy that's not going to have an acquisition cost if you just have to pay the third-party broker to chop his pay in half. Get him down to 275, and then you have him for next year as well. I know his numbers aren't pretty this year, but he started out the year well, and his numbers last year were excellent. I think he's a pretty reliable bet for one more year at 275. And not saying just Edmonton, like I would make the same argument for Carolina or somewhere else.
Well, Mrazek's a 4.25 right now is his cap hit, right? So if he got traded,
4.5.
Yeah, 4.25. So Chicago eats half, then he's 2.12. If you get a third team, then he's a $1 million goalie. Well, now you're talking. I think
you can't get a third team. Chicago. That's what I'm saying. Chicago can't retain. They used their last slot on Jones.
Okay, so then you got to find another team to eat $2 million. I think
it's not. But Chicago, I don't think is asking for anything from Mrazek.
No. But I'm saying, like, for a team to take him, you probably want to get the other team to broker it for another year, right? Like,
that's what I'm saying. But so he's 4.25. You're correct. I had it as 4.5 in my trade target, so I'll have to fix that. But you're right. I think getting him in that number is for one more year. Like you can't. If you were to go to market to get Mrazek this summer, you couldn't get him that cheap.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, not a half price for sure. So. Yeah, the goalie market's an interesting one. Teams it's delicate because you don't know how guys fit and, does their style fit the style of play? Are they good on cross crease play? Are they good off the rush? I'd have to dig into his numbers to see if he fits for certain teams. I've learned that from Woodley over the years, that just because the goalie has a good save percentage and good numbers on one team doesn't necessarily mean they translate to the next. So I think that's why we don't see a ton of goalie trades. I know Colorado did it, but we don't see a ton of them in season.
So, Lindgren, I also think interesting piece in Colorado.
Yeah, like they didn't really have to give up a lot to get him.
Well, I mean, still a second-round pick.
Yeah. But I think Lindgren's, I won't be surprised at all, Frank, if he resigns there.
I wouldn't touch him until you see what he looks like, to be honest. Not to say that this was a bad trade. I think this is a worthy gamble. Look, Colorado, the bottom three in their defense have really struggled this year. That third pair is among the worst in the league. Mm-hmm. And they've had to acknowledge that based on their lack of cap space and lack of depth. So I think like Lindgren, the first thing I think of is Warrior and really how much he put his body on the line for the New York Rangers on a night-to-night basis. But once he went into this season unsigned without an extension, the time was up. Like, you knew they were moving on. And I think for him, it was just like, can he get to a spot and perform when it matters? Can he cut down on glaring turnovers? And if he can do that in Colorado, it would make sense to re-sign him. But I think he's the perfect player to just use and see what happens. Don't pull the Mackenzie Blackwood and get him and sign him 4 days later. Give this one some time to see how he fits.
What do you make of the Rangers? They're the President's Trophy winner. They're not going to make the playoffs. It doesn't look like this year. Like, I don't think it's being talked about just what a brutal season it's been for the Rangers.
Well, I mean, how much does it say that they're waving the white flag on an UFA like Lindgren, and now also Riley Smith, who was held out of the lineup for trade protection? They're moving these guys no matter what. Like, they have not shown since the Four Nations break that they're a team that deserves to hang on to their players as own rentals. They haven't earned it. And I get totally where they're at. This is a season that went sideways off the rails after a 12-7 start, and they've got to readjust. Now, it's funny in saying that, if there is a younger player that pops up or a difference maker that the Rangers think they can get their hands on, like, I wouldn't be shocked with the cap space and assets that they have if they went after one at this deadline. Like, I think they're a true wild card team. We know they're going to move Smith. What else are the Rangers going to get up to? Can they preempt the market? What?
Move Kreider?
Well, I think if they could, they would, but yeah. I don't think that's happening. That said, I meant adding.
Yeah.
What kind of big piece, younger piece could they add if they could do it?
Well, interesting. Just tying into the Rangers, like Fox and Lindgren have been a pair for a while. They've been on the ice this year for more goals against than they were all of last year. Like, and we watched Adam Fox at the Four Nations, Frank. I know it's a really short tournament, but he didn't look very good and he didn't play very much. Like, I kind of wonder what happened. I'd love to do a deep dive with someone in New York on what happened to that top pair, because they used to be one of the best pairs in hockey. And this season, they've been average.
Yeah, totally agree. And to me, that's the number one goal, the mission and mandate for Chris Drury, is to figure out how to reinvent this defense core. Top to bottom, whether that means moving K'Andre Miller, whether it means whatever it takes. You've already done some of the heavy lifting with Trouba. Find out who's going to be part of this Ranger core. Schneider, I think, is part of it. Fox is obviously part of it. But after those two locked in positions, who's next? And not a coincidence to me that Zach Jones played the most minutes of any Ranger on Sunday night against the Preds. That was a pure showcase opportunity. They're trying to move Zach Jones. They've given Zach Jones permission to talk to other teams to help facilitate a trade. It's been difficult to come up with one. But the Rangers are also actually looking for a pretty decent asset in return for Jones. They think even as an undersized guy, he's got some offensive instinct. So Zach Jones on my trade board, figure out who else is out, and then start building that foundation on the blue line.
So now let's get to trade targets this week. I want to start with two teams, Frank, that have 6 guys combined in your top 20. The Islanders and the Kraken. Right, based on your trade targets, you look at the Seattle Kraken with Yanni Gourde and Brandon Tanev and Bjorkstrand, and then, of course, obviously Brock Nelson, he's number 1 on your list, Kyle Palmieri. Those two, do you expect both of those teams to be that aggressive, or do you still think there's a wild card factor here that the Islanders might try and re-sign some of their guys?
Well, there's definitely a wild card factor with the Islanders, just because, and I'm not talking playoffs, they're not in the wild card race, but the way they handle this is certainly a wild card, because I do believe that the Islanders have made an attempt to re-sign Brock Nelson in recent weeks. I think the team believes he's, quote, an Islander. Not sure what that means, but let me say this, and I'll say it clearly for the 467th time this season. Not trading the premier rental center on the market in Brock Nelson at this deadline is malfeasance and malpractice. They're not making the playoffs. They are not a competitive team. They are not a contending team. And they have the worst special teams on both sides in the league. They need assets, and this is a rare opportunity to recoup some, to bring some in. It's a first-round pick plus for Brock Nelson. Easily understandable. And if you're not picking there, fine. In a crappy draft, all good. But use that leverage to package and go after more high-end talent and skill, which for the life of me cannot understand why at any point people have talked about Noah Dobson potentially being on the move. I'm not saying it's impossible to happen. I'm just saying You've got Sorokin, Dobson, and Barzell. That's the list of where your high-end skill ends. To move one of them now, it doesn't make any sense to me. But to pass on this deadline without getting something valuable for Palmieri and Brock Nelson, I think is crazy. Absolutely,
100%.
absolutely crazy.
I'm 100% in agreement with you. I think there's teams. Brock Nelson brings a lot. He's 6'4". He's 215 pounds. He's skilled.
He's prematurely graying like I am.
Yeah, like he's to me, he is an ideal. You could play. He's a center, but you could play him wing if you need to at times with skilled guys. To me, all day, I think he's the most skilled player whose name's been out there that makes the most sense to get traded. And the Islanders, when you talk about, oh, he's an Islander, what does that even mean? He's an Islander. So what? Yeah, so he's going to be part of a mid-tier franchise, because that's what they are right now. They're stuck in the middle. They've been stuck in the middle. It's like they're still living on those back-to-back conference final playoff runs, thinking, well, that's who we are.
That was during COVID, by the way. Like,
I know
COVID doesn't exist anymore. Come on.
Yeah, and that's who you were 5 years ago. That's not who you are now. So right now you're a team that's close, but then doesn't make the playoffs, isn't really a competitor, and you're older. So go out there, and if Brock Nelson's truly an Islander and you love him, you have a conversation. We're going to trade you.
He's turning 34. What? He's not helping you. If you sign him to a 3-year deal, congratulations on signing him to a 3-year deal where you're not going to make the playoffs any of those 3 years.
No, not at all.
I'm just saying, like, I cannot say it any more clearly than this. If Brock Nelson is a New York Islander on Saturday morning when he wakes up, Lou Lamoriello should be fired on the spot. On the spot.
Yeah. It's hard to argue. Now, you've got Yanni Gourde, who now he is injured, but they're saying that, he could be back, maybe play this week. You got Oliver Bjorkstrand, got 1 year left at 5.4. Jamie Alexiak, 1 year left at 4.6.
Tanev is under 2.
So you got a lot of guys in Seattle.
Again, not competitive.
No,
I don't know how else to say it. Not a competitive team and needs assets. And if you don't want to draft, fine. But you've got to take the picks and you've got to take whatever you can get and package them to go after other stuff.
Yeah. And Brandon Tanev, pending UFA, he's up in your top 3. Like there's guys in Seattle that are going to be moved. So let's look at like Jamie Alexiak.
I want to mention this because I did tease it though with the Hawks thing. And this is another reason why I think this is super important for a team like Seattle. One of the things we've talked about all year long on this show has been, how do you find difference makers? How do you acquire them? It's not like going through McDonald's in a drive-through line, or in your case in Edmonton, McDavid's, and ordering chicken nuggets. Oh yeah, hey, we're just going to add a difference maker to our team. What? That's not how it works. But if you're Chicago now and you get that extra 2026 first-round pick from Florida, go look at their draft board now. They have 2 first-round picks this draft, 2 first-round picks next draft, and already a full complement and bevy of prospects. If you wanted to this summer, if you're Kyle Davidson now, you can go make an offer sheet, because you could lose your first-round pick the next 3 years. You've already got extras. It's not just the trade component. It adds additional flexibility to the offer sheet component. I'm telling you right now, this is going to be the summer of offer sheets. St. Louis proved that you can acquire players that way, and they got multiple players. And there is at least one owner in the NHL who has said to his GM, your only job this summer is to get me a player via offer sheet. Yeah. That's one. Yeah. Because every time before, when owners or anyone would ask about it, and I think this debunks the myth that it's like, oh, this is a gentleman's agreement that no one will do this to each other for fear of retribution and mutually assured destruction. The reason why owners didn't love offer sheets in the past is because their GM had convinced them that it's not an authentic way to actually acquire players. Look how few ever change hands. That's changing. This St. Louis and Edmonton thing with Holloway and Broberg changed, and then you see Holloway hit 20 goals. It's changed everything. Owners know now that you can actually get a player that way. The gloves are off. And there's a whole list of interesting RFA candidates this summer that you could do that with. So Seattle, you need a difference maker. You've got your full complement of picks, 25, 26, and 27. How about we add some first-round picks to the arsenal. Go after someone. Go do it.
Well, I think teams might have missed the boat on the offer sheet. And this, you got the salary caps going up so much the next few years. There's going to be more money available, and there's not a lot of top end guys. Like Rantanen needs a new deal, but Draisaitl's deal's already done. You know, Mitch Marner, but there's not as many of those guys who've taken a lot of the money. The mid-tier
What about
guys
RFAs that want to change of scenery?
Buddy, let me finish my thought. Okay. The fact is, if you look at all the extended cap space that there is in the NHL coming in next season, it's going to go to mid-tier players. And so like the Dylan Holloways, that was a great deal for St. Louis, but no team's going to walk away from it. Well, Edmonton did it, and I said at the time that's the one guy they should have matched. The Broberg one understood because they had 3 left defensemen. He's making 4.6, but $2 million, 2.2 for Dylan Holloway. Like young RFA agents don't want to look at it, but any other team to me would be a fool to walk away from a young player to get a second-round pick at 2.2 mil. Like they're going to have to jump up quite a bit higher, I think, to actually make it work now. Like last summer, I gave St. Louis a ton of credit. They did it when teams didn't have cap space. They should have done it the last 3 years. I think it'll be harder to have teams not match. They might not like it, but they'll match more because, you know, you'd rather take an established young player than a draft pick that's a second rounder or third rounder. Because you look at the floor for what it takes to match, it's not going to be as much. So I don't know if I see it. I get the theory, but I think you'll see more teams now. They have more cap space. They'll want to match.
I understand the point you're making, but this is also a tool for RFAs that are being held down that no longer necessarily want to be there. And I think another great example of that is JJ Peterka on the trade targets board. There's a lot of guys in Buffalo that are unhappy. I don't think he's any different than anyone else. A bona fide top line winger who's 23 and has been very productive. I've seen the mentions on social media that crushed me all weekend. Fake news. You're making it up. Why would Buffalo move on from Peterka? If they move him, might as well move the franchise. I mean, everyone on that team is unhappy for the most part. There's no path forward.
Yeah. Are they unhappy because of the constant losing? Is it how they're losing? What's the direction
it's led to? It's 14 years now of futility. And it's 5 years into the Kevin Adams regime that has changed nothing. No. They've added nice pieces, but they're in the same position that they're in now. And they've gone all year without making a move. So the reason I bring up his name is because he's a great example of, oh, well, he's under team control. There's no way the Sabres are going to move him. Okay, fine. But if he doesn't sign an extension, accepts or doesn't accept the qualifying offer and becomes an RFA on July 1st and signs a massive offer sheet, I mean, I guess the Sabres could match it, but are you going to match it to keep a guy that might not want to be there?
Funny. The Buffalo Sabres this year, Frank, have a .457 points percentage. In 21-22, they had a .457 points percentage. They went up a little bit, right? The year they had 91 points. Then they went down again to .512. Now they're at .457. So really, you think about it, 2022 till now, they're basically the same team. They haven't made the playoffs. They had a little bit of a rise, and now they've come back down to being a team that's not remotely competitive. So, yeah, I could see the frustration for players that they don't necessarily see a direction. And you and I have talked about this before. I think Buffalo's biggest error, the ownership group, was hiring management that was inexperienced and then surrounded with anybody who's experienced. And that's not necessarily his fault on its own, but they're going to have to look at something because what they're doing in Buffalo is clearly not working. We say 14 years, sure, but even the new regime has shown no real signs of improvement at all.
That's why I don't know what to make of their deadline. Like, you think of the guys on the board, Zucker, I mean, again, move him if you want to, but you were just talking a little while back about extending him. And he's had a really big year by his standards. I mean, arguably his best year since 17-18 with Minnesota. He's approaching 20 goals. Okay, so pending UFA, fine. But you've had Cousins out there. There have been whispers. Is Owen Power available? Peterka. I mean, I'm not saying you do something just for the sake of it, but how do you go through the entire sorry, miserable season and do nothing? That's the part that I go, it's not for lack of interest. The Sabres are getting calls. I'm sure there's a lot of deals being thrown at him that aren't that palatable, but there has to have been some reasonable, meaningful conversation or offer that at least makes you think and shake it up, because I think the worst thing you can do is fall in love with your players.
Well, they got to move Zucker for sure. And to me, like Jordan Greenway, he's huge body, can kill penalties. Like there'd be a lot
They
of
don't
teams
want to move
interested in that
Greenway.
guy.
They don't want to move him.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess, but
They should have moved him 2 years ago.
yeah,
Literally 2 years ago.
yeah. Like I think he'd have some value for teams, especially certain teams that, a guy who can kill penalties, big, strong, right? He's a useful, legit bottom six player. And bottom six guys are very important on your team. Don't like sometimes in the playoffs, the top guys even each other out. You need your bottom guys to be better. And so I would think you could move them, but you're right, Frank. If they don't make any moves, and even if they make some moves, they acquire some more draft picks. They don't need more draft picks. They need more NHL players.
So if you look at the trade targets board, who gets you really excited for a bottom six player?
Well, I'm kind of curious. I like Tanev's, like just his motor and his engine, right? Like the nickname Turbo. He for a bottom six, he intrigues me. I think like Riley Smith's a bottom six player now, is he not? And that's not a knock. I think he'd be a really good third line player. His playoff experience, he's proven he can show up in the playoffs. I think I would look at him more as a third line player now, and I'd have a fair amount of interest in him. Cap hit's a little bit high, but
I mean, I would, not to go Chicago again, I would go Ryan Donato or Jake Evans.
No, Jake Evans for sure. Donato for me, my curious thing about Donato, Frank, is he's never scored a playoff goal. When the games get more intense, is he going to play? That's my concern about him.
I'm just looking at his season going, he's got more goals than Gustav Nyquist had points. He got a second round pick. He's got double the number of goals. He's got 21 goals already. Double the number of goals of Jake Evans. And yet, and I think double the number of goals of Scott Lawton. And yet, his name is not talked about nearly as much as any of those three guys. Why is that? Like when you consider relative to value and the market and how this all shapes out, I was told the Montreal Canadiens have better than a late second round pick on the table for Evans. And the Flyers think that they can get something good for Scott Lawton.
Well, I guess the question for Donato is, where does he fit on your team, right? Like, I think we would agree, Frank, Jake Evans, third line center. If not, he's a really, really good fourth line center, right? Like, what his role is for sure. What would Donato be on a team? And he's not going to come to a playoff team and be on your top line. I'm not even sure he'd be on your second line, would he?
No, but I think the third line flexibility of center or winger is just fine. Do you need more than that? He's, again, 21 goals this year.
Yeah, well,
he only makes $2 million.
That's true.
Why is he in the different category than all the rest of these guys when the numbers tell you something different?
I wonder if he's a good player on a bad team, and then when you get him on a good team, he's not going to be as much of a contributor. I wonder if that's where they look at. I also now I will say this year he's added more kind of grit to his game, right? So that maybe he's like, hey, I got to play a little bit more inside. You see him you look at just his hits, and I know some people don't like looking at hits, but I do think hits matter at times for certain players, and he's been infinitely more physical and aggressive this year than he has been any other point in his career. So maybe he's trying to change. You know how it is. Sometimes people get a reputation and a certain type of player, and they don't think he changes. But a team could get a steal then, is what you're saying, right? You might get a way lower price.
Another relative steal would be Riley Smith.
Oh, yeah.
I think his playoff pedigree, I can think of no better fit for Riley Smith, especially if the Rangers retain half, than the Toronto Maple Leafs. Bring him back home to Toronto and inject some experience into that group, a guy who's been there and done it and won it. An integral piece of two different Stanley Cup final runs with the Golden Knights, including an excellent playoff run when they won the Cup in 23. I just think he's a tremendous ad at a not expensive price.
Oh, I think the Riley Smith one makes a lot. He's just another name in New York that's just kind of like what happened. Now you have a few interesting guys, Frank. 6 and 7 actually got traded for each other last season. Casey Middlestad and Bowen Byram. Middlestad, I don't think his style is fitting how Colorado wants to play. Byram's maybe more contract wise, and you alluded to unhappiness a little bit earlier on. Then you got Soucy, 8, and Ricard Raquel, who's got a lot of years left on his deal. Like the Vancouver one's interesting to me. And, Carson Soucy is a solid player, right? They wanted to improve their defense. They improved it. Now they're like, well, we want to get rid of him. And I know Quinn Hughes got hurt again, so maybe they're just going to sell. So let's start first with Vancouver. Then we'll get to those other two. But what do you make of the Canucks? The Hughes injury now, it's, they saying day to day, but we know the gong show that Elias Pettersson is being this year, or the no show, I should say. Vancouver has never been afraid to be aggressive. Do you think that they're aggressive in selling?
I don't think they will be. No, I think they value significantly getting into the playoffs, and they're right there on the edge. So I don't think they're going to cut the legs off of this team, even though they haven't played like a team that deserves it. I don't know what they'll do with Soucy. I think the way bigger question is, what do you do with Brock Besser? I think that's their biggest front burner item for them this week. I reported last week that the offer on the table was 5 years, 40 million, so 5 times 8. But Besser is looking for 6 or 7 years and thinks that he would be able to get that on the market this summer. If that's the case, I mean, it's not a huge raise on the 6.65 that he's been making to go from 6.65 to 8. And with the salary cap increases, it's basically going to be the same contract. And as a younger RFA, I think the market is on his side in terms of being able to go out and fetch that. But I think he's completely comfortable. Either go to market or stay in a place that you've really liked. So it's up to the Canucks. I think they're going to make their best and final offer this week. Here's the thing. I think the Canucks are also fine keeping him as a rental and seeing if they take another swing at Besser before he goes to market. I don't think that they feel a real sense of urgency one way or the other to make something happen. I think ideally they'd like to get a deal done. And when they decide that they want to get a deal done, they act pretty quickly. But it's really almost as simple as adding an extra year to their offer.
When you look at Brock Besser, and I actually, the term makes a lot of sense to me. I think Brock Besser is a really solid player. I don't put him in the elite category. My thoughts on long-term deals, as guys get older. But the fact that, he's injury prone, 10 games, 12 games, 14 games. He's already missed 7 games this year. How much do you think that factors into the guy? You say, okay, we're paying him this. But history tells us, other than the shortened season when he played all 56, and then last year when he played 81, every other year, he's 8 to 20 games locked in that he's going to miss.
It doesn't faze me at all. Because I look at his numbers this year, and he's on track, at least when I did the math last week, he's on track for 28 goals, and he's missed 7 games. That's with the 7 games missed. That's actually slightly above his career average. And a 28 goal scorer or 26 goal scorer, if that's what you want to call his career average, those guys get paid, and they're going to get paid. You mentioned earlier in the pod the idea of the middle class getting more of that money. To go from 6.65 to 8, that's normal. It really only comes down to the term for Van. And I just think if you are moving Brock Besser, or if Brock Besser is leaving you and you've already said goodbye to JT Miller, I just think, and we don't know what happens with Pettersson, they're going to likely try and do whatever they can to trade him. The Canucks are going to, in short order, be a very long way from being a competitive, contending team. They already are not close, but just removing a 26 or 28 goal scorer brings you further away. What
about a guy like Puis Suter? He's having a hell of a year, right? He's making 1.6. He's put himself, his perfect timing for a guy like that to score 20 goals, be a UFA. Did they just, now he's played well. I would keep him because I agree with you, but do they consider the calls and say, geez, maybe this guy's value now is never going to be higher. Let's move him because we probably won't be able to afford him.
I just think in the end, the second you move him, you're going to go out and try and find another one. So just keep him at that point. And I wonder if he's no different than a lot of these other guys that we've seen in recent years that have big numbers that won't ever attract a massive deal. I think of Daniel Sprong, always puts up numbers, and go through the list of guys that are considered empty calorie point getters. I mean, they're everywhere. And I don't think like the market is really clamoring, not to say that Suter can't do other things, but look at Phil Kurashev last year in Chicago. 54 points, 18 goals. No one was knocking down their door to get him. There was another guy on the Sens recently that had a similar run like that. These guys are just, it's not a dime a dozen because it's hard to score 18 goals and 54 points in an NHL season. But I think teams kind of see through it. And I would put Suter in that category.
Well, the one thing that I find different about Suter than those other two is Suter kills penalties, right? Like he's the leading penalty killer on Vancouver. Daniel Sprong coaches never trusted him defensively. Suter's actually pretty good defensively, and now he's added some offense. And the other thing is this guy's been consistent with his offensive production every year. 14 goals, 15 goals, 14 goals, 14 goals. Now he's at 16, right? 27, 36, 24, 29, 28 points. He's obviously going to score more before this season goes. It's his 5th year in the league. He's 28. I think Suter, because he's actually got a defensive game to him as well, I think will get paid in the offseason and could be. Now, you don't want to overpay him. I get it. But I think he'll get 3 sheets at least, I bet you, in the summertime.
Okay.
Other teams, Frank, because we've talked about some of the players. What do you think the New Jersey Devils are thinking right now? Because suddenly, I know that the Devils, all year long is the Devils are in the playoffs. Devils are in the playoffs. Well, suddenly they're 4 points ahead of both Columbus. Well, 4 points ahead of Columbus, 6 ahead of Detroit. Columbus and Detroit both have games in hand. And what's odd about the Devils is the good news is they don't really play any of the top teams in the East anymore. Carolina, Washington, Tampa, Florida, Toronto. They don't play them. But they actually play 9 games, which is odd for an Eastern team. 9 games against the West, 2 against Winnipeg, 2 against Minnesota. They got Edmonton, Vancouver. And they play, though, the teams that they're battling. Columbus twice, Boston twice. They play Ottawa. They play Detroit. They play the Rangers. So you can argue that they control their destiny because they're going to play all the teams trying to chase them. But where do you they're a team that's started off well and is just slowly, gradually, it's like their comfort level in the playoff spot erodes by the week.
It's not even that they started off well. They just played more games than everyone else. And the cushion in the standings that you looked at was never really it's like objects in the mirror are closer than they appear. That's what we've been looking at with the Devils.
Do you think they make a move? Do they need to add something? Do they need to boost their lineup here a little bit?
Well, they are looking to add. They're looking for a center. They're looking for additional secondary scoring punch. But what does this Jack Hughes injury, if anything, do? And so both Hughes brothers are banged up. And then I think a more holistic view is necessary. They had a great summer, and the guys that they brought in really changed the identity of the way that they defend. But you don't go from non-playoff team typically to contending team in one offseason and season. It takes a solid, steady build. And I have major questions about their ability to do that with Jack Hughes as their top dog. Now, he's got a nice supporting cast, and I don't think Nico Hischier gets nearly enough love for his game and how consistent he is, and also Jesper Bratt and how good he is. But Four Nations, if it taught us anything, it's that Hughes is nowhere close. And I just don't know if this is the year to really go wild and say, hey, let's bring in, even as much as we could say as much as we want that the East is wide open. I think a significant change in the balance of power with the Seth Jones trade. I would be very afraid of Florida now.
Tampa Bay looks really good too.
And Tampa's won 8 straight. They're the hottest team in the league. So if you asked me, hey, why is Friday going to be interesting? What are some reasons to look out for? Toronto, Tampa, Washington, New Jersey, Columbus, Detroit, Winnipeg, Edmonton, LA, and Vancouver have all not made moves yet. That's 10 of the 16 playoff teams. Will New Jersey go out and do something? I think they will, but I think it should be measured because it's not just the numbers, the eye test. The way this team has played over the last 6 weeks, they don't deserve a major addition. They're not ready yet.
I totally agree. Yeah, 100% agree. Like, I wonder if they look and say, they got 4 young defensemen. There's not room for all of them to come in. I wonder if they're to say, hey, like, let's make a good hockey trade here. Move one of these guys and help augment other areas of our team.
I think that's probably an off-season surgery, don't you think?
Potentially, yeah. But I think it's something that they should seriously look at, right? You've got Seamus, Casey and Nemec and Hughes. I really like, Kovacevic. He's come in and probably out. Well, obviously he's performed better than they ever thought he would, and he's been great. But you know what? Sometimes, I know it sounds odd, but that's a position of strength. You can move one of them and you still have a lot of strength. And I think if you move the right one, you can get a good return. And that's probably an off-season thing, maybe, but maybe it's a move that you consider doing at the deadline.
Yeah, I don't think Simon Nemec is long for New Jersey and the organization. I really don't even see a path for him to play. But again, I don't know why it would make sense to do it now when you could wait and have 31 other teams in the mix in the summer.
Yeah, all depends the return, right? Like,
I think the focus would be, can we get a third line center, an upgrade over Eric Halla, and can we find additional secondary scoring punch? Like Kyle Palmieri, I think is a great fit. He's already played in New Jersey. He's from New Jersey. I could see Brock Besser being a great fit. They need a 25 goal scorer to put on the wing somewhere.
That'd be nice. Let's bring in Tyler Yaremchuk to the pod. Ty, how you doing?
Doing good, boys. Ready to go for deadline week here. New edition of Buy or Sell brought to you by our friends at Bet365. Download the app today. Use the promo code NATION. Whatever the moment, it's never ordinary at Bet365. Got a handful of teams I want to ask you guys about quickly on Florida with Tkachuk on LTIR. Buy or sell, Florida makes another big move before the deadline. Frank?
Buy. I think the Florida Panthers were very active last week. I hinted at it on a Daily Faceoff YouTube video that I did on Saturday night, breaking down the trade. And that LTIR space that they've got from Matthew Tkachuk, I don't think they go out and exceed the cap with this Seth Jones deal, moving Spencer Knight back, unless they didn't think Matthew would be ready for the regular season. So they've got an opportunity to further strengthen this team. I was told that they had some larger conversations. Whether or not that materializes, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think they were in on a lot of different things.
Bill Zito, look at the big trades he has made. You know what? You go back to Bennett, right? Tkachuk, Reinhart, Montour. Now you throw in Seth Jones. He is not afraid to wheel and deal. So I got to buy all day long. Like, he's become one of the best traders in the NHL. It's really augmented his team. There's no debate on that.
Yeah. One interesting thing to add. So I'd say when looking at Florida and their trades, they moved the right goalie before, Devin Levi, in a great deal. Does the same thing happen with Spencer Knight? Like, are they armed with intel that would allow them to have made the correct decision on when to move on from Knight? That's one part of it. But the other side, conversely, would be the Panthers had a lot more leverage than I think they realized. Jones had only given Chicago 2 teams that he was willing to accept a deal to. One of them was the Dallas Stars, and they didn't have any interest. So in the end, it really was just the Florida Panthers. And if so, that means the Panthers have given up a pretty significant amount. The second time in a row now, they did this with the Giroux deal as well, and they gave up a lot for Giroux. The difference is Giroux was a rental. Seth Jones has 5 years left, so maybe you feel a lot better about it. Yeah. But they had more leverage than I think they knew at the time.
Interesting. Next team, we'll do one more in the East, then I'll go out West. The Toronto Maple Leafs make 2 additions ahead of the deadline. Don't know the caliber, but I'm going to say they add 2 pieces to the roster. Buy or sell, Greggs?
Yeah, I'm buying. I think Brad Treliving looks at his team. I think he believes he's got a lot of positives on his team, but at the same time, there's a few areas we all know. I think it's captain obvious. They're looking for a center, and I also think they're going to augment their blue line. You can never have enough defensemen. And Chris Tanev plays the game so hard. He's always one block shot away from having to miss a game or two in the playoffs. So I would add a defenseman.
Yeah, I think the defenseman part is interesting. I'm gonna I think last week did we set the line at 2.5 for the Leafs, and I took the over.
Oh, I thought you took the under. That's why I asked this.
That's all right. I'm going to say they get Scott Lawton, and I'm going to go way off the board. I said how Riley Smith would make a ton of sense. I wonder if they grab someone like Lucas Reichel from Chicago. Way further down the list, number 27 on my trade targets board, but that would be an interesting one. I think he has some high-end potential, and you put him with high-end players, be fascinating.
All right, 2 in the West now for you guys. The St. Louis Blues. I think it's interesting some of the chatter around them, but all those guys have terms. So I'm going to say the Blues. They're back in the mix now as well. The Blues stand still and make 0 moves at the deadline. They don't bring anyone in. They don't send anybody out. Zip for the Blues. Frank, buy or sell?
I'll buy. They're right back in the mix. To your point, they've taken 9 of their last 12 available points. They are 1 point back with Calgary having 2 games in hand. I don't think Doug Armstrong likes this team by any stretch of the imagination, but they have to play it out to see if they can get in. And the prices that he's been asking for his players are exorbitant. Braden Shen, 2 first-round picks or equivalents and more if you want them to retain. It's just too much. So unless he softens on that price, I just don't think anyone's willing to step up and pay it. At least my understanding is the conversations on Shen to this point haven't gone very far, because Armstrong has essentially said, if I'm going to ask my captain to waive his no trade, it better be for something good.
Fair. Greggs?
I'm going to sell because I think they're going to get a bottom 6 winger. I think they would like a little bit better production from their bottom 6 wingers. So it's not going to be a big splash. They've got cap space to add a third line winger.
Like what kind of guy are you thinking of?
Well, you know what? Riley Smith I think Riley Smith to that team would help, because if you look at their upfront forwards, right? Like there are a lot of young guys don't have any playoff experience, and that's okay. But, Holloway and Neighbors and Jordan Kyrou and Robert Thomas, Braden Shen obviously has some, but other than that, I think they have a ton. So I think Riley Smith makes a lot of sense to St. Louis.
All right, last one for you guys. We'll go to the Pacific Division here, where I'm going to say we get a bit of a surprise. And the team that makes the biggest add in the Pacific will be the LA Kings. They got cap space. They've been kind of accruing all year. They got some picks, got some prospects. Greg's buy or sell. The Kings make the biggest add in the Pacific.
LA they're an interesting team. They've been up and down. They closed the gap, then they lost a few here recently. They played really well, and I think they have some guys offensively who they're hoping for a little bit more from, right? I think they probably hope that Byfield would have a little bit more production. They're really happy with Warren Fogel's production, but Fiala and Byfield specifically. But that's a fascinating question. I'm gonna sell because I can't rule out Vegas. And they're super aggressive, and I think Vegas will make something. I think Edmonton should, and if they don't, I think Frank talked about the Islanders. If they don't do much, I think if the Edmonton Oilers don't make a few changes, to me, that's just unacceptable. Ken Holland, for 3 years, they were in LTIR all year long, and they still made trades. Don't tell me that just because you have Kane potentially coming back that you're handcuffed. You still got cap space. Figure out. Edmonton clearly has some areas of weakness they should address, because they got Leon Draisaitl is the best player, and then they got the other guy who's considered the best player on their team. They're pretty good. So, but I'm going to say Vegas or Edmonton. Either one should make a bigger splash.
Frank?
Totally see your logic and reasoning, and it is hard to count out Vegas. I would not bet on Edmonton to do something big. I'm going to buy, though. And for this reason, If the Carolina Hurricanes are moving Mikko Rantanen, I would put the odds on him landing in LA.
Really?
Man, he fits everything that they want to do.
Oh,
So
yes.
I think they're very interested. I think they're one of the teams that has been calling Carolina to remind them how interested they are if they get to a place where they're at an impasse or don't know what they're going to do. So I think Vegas would be in that conversation too, especially if Carolina is willing to retain. I mean, Vegas could make anything happen, but that would be the one team I would have circled as a landing spot for Rantanen.
What do you think it would cost to get Rantanen at the deadline?
Well, I knew someone was going to ask that, and I don't have an answer for you because I look at the roster and I go, okay, Carolina obviously doesn't want just futures back if they're going to do this. They're going to want a piece that helps them for their playoff push, which is why they went out and got Rantanen. I can't come up with a great answer, and that's the problem. And I've been thinking about it for days.
Yeah, because that's the same with me. I looked and I'm like, God, like I like LA's roster, but does LA have now? They got some young guys for sure in the system, but I don't think you can trade Rantanen for young guys when you gave up, Netchus and Drury, right? I know that even though they thought Netchus they might get a pay, he was still a legit, proven NHL guy. So it's more the return I'm finding fascinating on if he does get traded. What would they be looking for in return?
And how is if you're looking at it from Carolina's perspective, the biggest change would be you're not getting anyone back that's nearly as high end, right? Like you could say, hey, we'll take Philip Deneau or Trevor Moore or someone, but they're not Deneau is a great player, but also has trade protection. But getting Trevor Moore back it's not going to help the Canes the way that Rantanen would. So are you better off just keeping him for the playoff run and dumping him?
Yeah, that's the challenge in Carolina, man. God, you're kind of pot committed. You're kind of pot committed. Like you made the deal, and this time at least, Frank, they did make him a significant offer, which they didn't do it against him. So at least his camp knows a starting point.
Yeah, but if you're him, why? I wouldn't sign right now because the money is going to be no different really anywhere this summer. 7 years or 8 years, whether you get 90-some million bucks or 110, it's not. I mean. I'm not laughing off 15 million bucks, but it doesn't make a huge difference. You're going to want to pick your destination. Why limit the field? Because you could always wait until June 30th and get a real good sense of what that market looks like and then re-sign in Carolina and keep the 8th year. You're not crossing it off. You're just saying, I'm not committing now.
But if there was ever a market that could convince him to stick around, wouldn't it be a Vegas or an LA, Frank? Or is that just...
Oh, I think that's a real possibility. Yes. And that's why I think that adds to it.
Yeah. Because if you're Carolina, you say, okay,
but he's still, I guess to answer your question though, if you're a team that's going out to acquire Rantanen at this deadline, you're doing so fully operating under the perspective that we don't think we're going to get a commitment from this guy. Yeah. I think that's how you have to go into it.
All right. There you go, boys. That is a wrap on this week's edition, a deadline week edition of Buy or Sell.
We only got about a minute and a half, so quickly I want to go to Byram and Middlestad. Either one get moved?
I think Middlestad, yes. Byram, no. Wouldn't be shocked to see Buffalo do very little this week. I think Colorado's motivated to change up what their center position looks like. Middlestad could have been it, hasn't been it, and has real value. And I think there's some teams that are looking at it going, hey, we've got some cost certainty with Middlestad. Let's try and get our hands on him.
One guy I think's getting moved for sure, Frank, is Trent Frederick.
Oh, yeah.
I think he offers so much that teams are looking for.
I agree. The question is, what's the price? And I think that's what a lot of teams are going to have to figure out. Certain guys are going to be overvalued based on the different elements that they bring in.
Yeah. I wonder, does he get a second and then a fourth instead of just a first? You know what I mean?
I don't think it's going to be a first. I don't think someone's giving up a first.
And then one last one. Connor Murphy, Chicago. He's got 1 year left at $4.1 million. We just saw them move Seth Jones. I don't know how many guys, they can't, what, if you're Chicago, you got to keep somebody, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, if the right deal came along and it was a package, hey, we want Donato and Murphy from you. I mean, I guess, but the real value in Murphy was chopping him down in half. And since the Hawks don't have a retained salary transaction slot left, I don't know how much someone's really going to knock their socks off to get him. So I'd keep him. And I think it's definitely back burner this week for the Hawks.
We'll be here all week. You can watch Frank and Ty every day, of course, at noon Eastern, 10 a.m. Mountain Time. And of course, we will have a Thursday trade deadline edition of the pod, brought to you as always by Bet365. Enjoy trade week. I'm Jason Gregor on behalf of Frank Saravalli, Tyler Remchuk. Have a wonderful Monday.
What's up, hockey fans? If you enjoyed that video, then you need to be hitting the subscribe button right here at Daily Faceoff. Exclusive interviews and analysis from our hockey insider Frank Saravalli, fantasy updates from Brock Sagan, and a daily live show at noon Eastern, Monday through Friday. You don't want to miss any of the fantastic content, so hit that subscribe button.